Olá, começa agora o Agro América, aqui no canal AgroMais, um programa produzido em parceria com o Instituto Interamericano de Cooperação para a Agricultura, o ICA. Falamos sobre boas práticas agrícolas que podem ser reproduzidas nos 34 Estados-membros em prol de uma agricultura sustentável e o bem-estar rural. Hoje nós vamos falar sobre o Centro de Segurança Alimentar e Saúde Pública da Universidade Estadual de Iowa, dos Estados Unidos, que lançou um portal na internet de biossegurança para avicultores e pecuaristas, que permite visitar fazendas virtuais para conhecer os riscos de doenças, saber medidas e quais medidas de biossegurança devem ser tomadas, criar um plano de biossegurança e, além disso, a plataforma é gratuita e disponível em inglês e espanhol. Vamos falar então sobre este portal e sobre a situação fitossanitária dos países produtores de proteína animal no continente americano. O meu entrevistado é Dr. James Roth, veterinário e diretor do Centro de Segurança de Alimentação e Saúde Pública. Dr. Roth, welcome to Agro America. It's a pleasure having you here, speaking you from Brasilia to Iowa. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be able to speak with your group and your audience, and thank you for the invitation.
Well, let's start then. I would like for you to please share with us more about the Center for Food Security and Public Health, the objective the center has today as a great hub for research, and this portal that was created in order to aid producers throughout the Americas with biosecurity.
Yes, we started the Center for Food Security and Public Health about 20 years ago, and the mission was to increase national and international preparedness for accidental or intentional introduction of diseases that threaten food security or public health. And by food security, we're dealing with animal diseases, livestock and poultry diseases. We've developed a number of resources working with the state and federal authorities in the U.S. One set of resources is called the Secure Food Supply Plans. These are all available on our website for free download, anybody that wants to use them, and they're available in English and Spanish. So for the secure food supply plans, there's a secure poultry supply plan, secure beef, secure pork, and secure milk supply plan. And these plans are for the larger commercial producers primarily. And they have recommendations on biosecurity, surveillance, traceability, and a lot of things that need to be done to prevent or respond to a large disease outbreak. And for smaller producers, we've recently produced what we call Biosecurity Your Way, and it helps lead the small producers through what they need to do to prepare their smaller operations and protect them from disease introduction. Also available in English and Spanish, and free download for anybody that wants to use it.
Fantastic. Dr. Roth, beginning our discussion here, it's obvious that there are different ways that producers from large to medium to small size producers have to deal with biosecurity and the types of resources that they have to acquire in order to deal with different situations. I'd like to begin with talking about how the animal health situation is today in the continent, especially in the countries that are large producers of animal protein in the Americas. How do you find the situation right now, considering that there are many outbreaks of different diseases, but at the same time, these countries are able to control many of these outbreaks?
Yes, we're very fortunate in this hemisphere. Canada, the U.S., Mexico, Brazil, Argentina are free of some of the most important diseases that limit trade. Specifically foot and mouth disease and African swine fever. And that provides a very favorable trade status so that we're able to export freely to many other countries in the world. However, at the same time, and since in the U.S., and that's what I can speak to most, we're free of FMD, foot and mouth disease, without vaccination. That we're very aware that makes us very vulnerable to the introduction of FMD because if that virus would get into the U.S., our animals don't have any immunity to it because we're not vaccinating. So we really are focusing on keeping it out at the borders. The U.S. government has done a good job of keeping it out at the borders and educating our public veterinarians and private veterinarians on what these diseases are and how to recognize them, and educating our producers on how to keep these diseases out of their herds or flocks.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And how do you deal with such a disease without vaccination today? And I like to bridge into Brazil's situation, which is a country also who has declared itself free from FMD, decided to stop vaccinating against FMD. Given the health context in South America, what is your view on this situation, and how do these countries actually keep themselves free without vaccination?
Well, that's the same situation we have in the U.S., although there are other countries in South America that potentially may have infection with FMD, so you may be closer to it. But it requires a very good well-educated, well-funded veterinary services, the public veterinary services. And in the U.S., that's both federal and state, and a well-educated private veterinary services ready to recognize the diseases and respond very quickly. A quick response is essential, especially if you're not vaccinating. In the U.S., we worry that the disease could spread so fast because our animals have no immunity that it could quickly get out of control. So we're focusing on keeping it out, finding it quickly, but also building up a stockpile of vaccines for FMD in case we need it, because it may spread so quickly that we can't stamp it out, and we'll need vaccination to keep it under control. So we need to have a stockpile of foot and mouth disease vaccines.
Mm-hmm. And how do small producers have to treat something like FMD with regard, in comparison to large producers? When we're looking at these types of health statuses, we also have to take into account that many of the producers in the United States and Brazil, at least cow producers and such, they're usually large producers with a lot of land. When we look at other countries in the continent, most of these producers, they're small, medium-sized farmers. So how do each one of them have to deal with FMD in their respective cases?
So in the U.S., we have a lot of small producers. There are a lot more small producers than large producers, but most of the animals are on large production sites. However, when we're considering trade status, if a small producer becomes infected, the whole country will lose exports. So we really need to make the small producers aware of how to implement biosecurity, recognize the disease if they see it, and call their veterinarian to come look at the animals and be ready to quickly respond. So both the large and small producers need to be ready to respond quickly.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. And that provokes quite a different status with regard to a country's availability and lack of risk, let's say, in terms of being able to export their food. So when we're looking at countries such as the United States or Brazil or Argentina or Uruguay or Mexico, for example, which are large producers of poultry or bovine meat, they all have to look at this situation with a lot of care. My question is, how important is the public health service in order to keep these countries safe? And how do they work today in order to communicate with themselves, in order to keep the region safe from these kinds of outbreaks?
Well, it's very important to maintain a well-funded, well-established public veterinary services to be able to respond quickly. The World Organization for Animal Health sets the standards that they expect that the country's veterinary services will have to detect and respond to the foreign animal diseases. If we get a foreign animal disease, then we work to eradicate it. And once we think we've eradicated it from our country, we have to convince the World Organization for Animal Health that we've eradicated it. But you also have to convince all of your trading partners one at a time that you're free. And the trading partners want to know that you have a well-functioning veterinary services so that if the virus is there, you will be able to detect it. One of the situations in the US, and I'm sure in other countries, is there's a real desire and need to cut taxes and cut services. But we need to realize when exports are a major part of our economy, we have to maintain the veterinary services and not cut that, because if we cut that, we will have a very hard time detecting and responding to the disease and convincing our trading partners that we are once again free of the disease. So a well-established, well-funded public and private veterinary services is essential.
Mm-hmm. And how does this work out with the private services? And we can take the United States as an example, because we see that having good quality of produce to be exported is important, but without the veterinary services and without a constant surveillance, you can lose all the status and you can actually hinder a country's exports and profits because of that. So in a sense, veterinary services are essential for any sort of production. Is that correct? And how is it? How does that intertwine with the private sector in the United States?
So it's important that both the public and the private sector are well aware of these diseases and the response. About 15 years ago, the U.S. decided it needed to have better education for the private veterinarians on foreign animal disease detection and response. And they started the veterinary accreditation program, requiring private veterinarians that are accredited to take continuing education on how to detect and respond to these diseases. So that program has made us in better shape than we used to be, because the public veterinarians have that education, and now the private veterinarians have it available to them also.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Well, Dr. Roth, we're going to go for a short break, and afterwards we'll continue with this conversation. Para você que vem nos assistindo, fique por aí. O Agro América volta em instantes com a conversa com o Dr. James Roth, da Universidade de Iowa. Até já! Olá, está de volta o Agro América aqui no canal AgroMais, hoje conversando sobre biossegurança, principalmente para os países produtores de proteína animal. O meu entrevistado é o Dr. James Roth, veterinário, que está falando diretamente do Centro de Segurança Alimentar e Saúde Pública na Universidade Federal de Iowa. Dr. Roth, welcome back again, here for our second block. I'd like to talk about back to foot and mouth disease and talk about the importance of a needs of a stockpile of vaccines in order to attend any sort of emergency. What does this kind of biosecurity protocol entail, and how do you supply these vaccines to producers, and what type of percentage or maybe amount of vaccines are needed in order to prevent anything that could take an account for these producers, right?
Well, if we have an FMD outbreak in the U.S., the first approach will be to stamp it out, isolate the cattle and depopulate that herd. But we're very concerned that it might spread too quickly. So the U.S. government in recent years has spent up to $80 million building a stockpile of foot and mouth disease vaccine, and they're going to continue increasing that stockpile. The vaccines have to meet the USDA requirements that any other US-made vaccines have. And we've been fortunate. There are at least two companies that meet the requirements. The one that we use a lot is Biogenesis Bago in Argentina. About 15 years ago, we started working with Biogenesis to demonstrate that they have high-quality vaccines that meets the USDA requirements. I've been on 4 inspection tours of the Biogenesis factory, and they've passed every time. They're doing an excellent job. And part of that is because SENASA, the government in Argentina, is a world reference laboratory for foot and mouth disease, and the USDA has a lot of confidence in the testing that SENASA does on the vaccine, testing that we can't do in the U.S. because we don't want to have the virus in the U.S. even for testing purposes. So that's been a very good partnership to provide vaccines so that we can respond quickly if we have an outbreak.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. This ties into the structure for best prevention and preparedness measures for countries, especially those who depend on meat exports for their finance, for their income in general. Countries like Brazil, United States, Argentina are some of these examples, and for which security really is important. So keeping these prevention measures and preparedness measures is important also for international markets. When you look at international exports and food security, what are the basic principles about keeping these best prevention and preparedness measures up to date?
It's extremely important to keep it out of the country. That's where the initial focus has to be, because once it gets in the country, even if we find it and have vaccines, all exports will be lost on day one with either foot and mouth disease or African swine fever in the case of pigs. So the federal government needs a very good plan on how they're going to respond. In the U.S., we have the FMD Red Book, which lays out the process that the USDA will use if we get foot and mouth disease, and an African swine fever Red Book. And these are both available on the USDA website that lays out the plan of how USDA tries to keep it out and how they will respond if it gets in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When we're talking about African swine fever, recently in the last few years, we had a case, which I remember was in the island of Hispaniola, which are 2 countries are located there, the Dominican Republic and Haiti. In this case, there was a resurgence of this disease in the Dominican Republic and in other countries, and it was quite the international stress in order to keep that disease controlled, because the risk factor of it spreading out either through different farms or even through human beings is immense. So especially looking at a country like the Dominican Republic, that depends a lot on tourism, thinking about tourists going to these farms and then leaving the country is quite the stress level, right, for countries like the United States to have this come back into their countries. This looks at a lot at, the availability and the possibility of these diseases spreading at quite an ease, right? A facile way of going around. When we're looking at something like avian flu, which is not controlled by human beings so well because it depends on the bird's route internationally, we're looking at a whole different scenario. So how do you look at avian flu, especially because there's a resurgence of this disease year in and year out throughout the continent, and we're looking at some countries like Chile seeing their marine animals are being infected by H5N1. How do you look at the preventative measures and the security measures that these countries need to take in this type of disease that is spread around by birds that fly all over the world?
Yes, that's very difficult. We had a big outbreak in the U.S. in 2015 in our domestic poultry, and it came under control in June when the weather warmed up, and we thought it would come back, but it didn't. But then in 2022, this new H5N1 started occurring in the wild birds and then into our poultry. And it's very important to have extremely good biosecurity on poultry facilities, especially the very large commercial facilities. And I understand that the wild waterfowl in South America are being found with this virus, along with some of the mammals. So the poultry industry in the U.S. is working very hard to try and keep it out. We still have breaks. And I would recommend that the poultry industry in South America really increase their biosecurity, because if it's in the wild waterfowl, there's a good chance it will get into the domestic poultry. Now, fortunately, South America is in summer right now, and influenza viruses like cold weather. So we're seeing a resurgence here now that we're in winter in North America. But I would really advise South America to get ready for when your winter comes and this virus might start getting into your commercial poultry. Now, unlike foot and mouth disease, where if we get a single case, we'll lose all of our beef and pork exports, high path avian influenza, many countries are able to regionalize. So by finding it quickly and stamping it out, it's just affecting exports from certain regions, not from the whole country. But that's where you have to have a very good veterinary services to convince your trading partners it's only in that region, not in other regions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When we're looking at avian flu or African swine flu, what are the basic principles that producers either from large poultry producing plants or small producing plants need to take in account in order to, first of all, keep themselves safe, as well as look at biosecurity measures for emergency action?
So the most important thing for poultry and swine producers, the large producers have their animals indoors typically. So keep the animals indoors, have a very good line of separation between the animals and the exterior environment, and nothing should get into where the animals are. You have to have excellent biosecurity. Poultry that are outside, especially small producers, are exposed to the wild waterfowl, and they shed the virus in their feces, so they are unprotected. If it gets to be a problem, one of the best things the small producers can do is keep their birds inside, and then always change your boots and don't carry anything that might have the virus on it into the house where the birds are. And we have a lot of details on that on the website that I mentioned at Secure Food Supply.
Fantastic. So looking back at what we started speaking about at the beginning of the program, the Center for Food Security and Public Health developed this type of online platform in order to help producers look at different situations that they can be exposed to with these types of diseases, looking at virtual farms. So do you think that this type of application, use of technology, is in high demand? How do you think that producers need to engage more with these kinds of resources in order to educate themselves, but also to get in touch with their local, either private or public veterinary services to improve their biosecurity situation?
So we have some examples of different farms that you can look at, and these are Google Maps pictures of these farms, and decide where to put certain biosecurity structures to protect your farm. But every farm needs to have their own plan, and I would encourage every farm to develop a Google Map picture of your farm and decide where you're going to have the line of separation and where you're going to allow traffic and you won't allow traffic.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. And is there something that for the Center for Food Security and Public Health, a message perhaps, or perhaps a cautionary advice that you would give to producers in the Americas, North, South, Central America, and the Caribbean about biosecurity that needs to be taken into account?
Yes. Biosecurity, as I said, is extremely important. And the producers need to do it for their own sake and the sake of their animals, because only the producer has the power to keep the virus out of their facilities. So they really need to take this very seriously. And there are things they can do to protect their farm. All of this information we've developed is freely available in English and Spanish. Unfortunately, it's not in Portuguese, but it's freely available for anyone. And our producers in the U.S., we're encouraging them to go in and use these materials to develop their own biosecurity.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Roth, I recommend giving us a translation in Portuguese. I'm sure Brazilian producers would love to get to know the platform and the center's work. And I'd like to thank you so much for your time here. But our time for the program is up, and I hope to be able to invite you once more to talk about disease prevention, biosecurity at our program.
All right. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Bom, eu conversei com o Dr. James Roth, que é veterinário e diretor do Centro de Segurança Alimentar e Saúde Pública da Faculdade de Medicina Veterinária da Universidade Estadual de Iowa, nos Estados Unidos. Espero que vocês tenham gostado dessas informações, da importância e do investimento da biossegurança nas fazendas, na propriedade rural em todo o continente americano. Eu fico por aqui e aguardo vocês no próximo Agro América. Até já!